The brutal midday sun beat down on the grand courtyard of the Iron Keep as Helen knelt in the thick, unforgiving dust, her hands desperately clutching a roll of complex architectural blueprints. Alpha King Kalen stood towering above her, his heavy silver armor reflecting a blinding, arrogant light, while the entire royal court watched with cold, mocking eyes. He snatched the delicate parchment from her trembling fingers and threw it violently into the mud, entirely dismissing her brilliant structural calculations as the pathetic, childish scribbles of a weak, useless burden. "I absolutely reject this mating bond," he roared, his deep, booming voice echoing off the highly unstable stone walls she had desperately tried to warn him about. "I need a fierce warrior queen, not a pathetic, fragile shadow playing in the dirt." The brutal, crushing weight of his public rejection violently severed the sacred golden thread between their souls, sending a massive, blinding shockwave of pure, agonizing pain directly through her fragile chest. She stared down at her ruined blueprints, the exact, flawless mathematical designs that could have saved his crumbling, arrogant empire, completely destroyed by his massive, heavy boots. The high nobles laughed loudly, their cruel sneers violently wrapping around her neck like a suffocating iron chain. She slowly raised her striking amber eyes, entirely refusing to let a single hot tear fall onto the dirty stones. She realized in that absolutely devastating moment that her breathtaking intellect was far too magnificent to be wasted on a blind brute who worshipped only hollow steel. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. The freezing, damp air of the subterranean cellars bit harshly through Helen's thin canvas tunic, but she completely ignored the bitter, agonizing cold. Her entire intense focus was absolutely anchored to the small, rough scrap of stolen parchments spread carefully across the flat surface of a heavy wooden barrel. A single tiny flame from a scavenged tallow candle cast long dancing shadows against the dark stone walls, completely illuminating her soot-stained fingers as they tightly gripped a small, sharp piece of dark charcoal. While the rest of the massive Iron Keep slept in loud, ignorant bliss, Helen was completely awake, her magnificent, brilliant mind operating at a terrifying, breathtaking speed. This tiny, freezing alcove was her absolute only true sanctuary, a secret hidden world where she was absolutely not a pathetic, abused servant, but a supreme master architect of unparalleled genius. She did not draw simple, beautiful pictures of blooming flowers or grand royal portraits like the pampered noble ladies, sleeping comfortably far above her head. She drew the absolute, raw, brutal reality of physical force and massive structural tension. Her calloused hand moved with a frantic yet completely absolute, flawless precision, sketching the incredibly complex interior skeletal structure of the massive southern tower. She closed her striking amber eyes for a single brief second, perfectly visualizing the entire massive stone edifice, completely stripping away the beautiful, expensive velvet tapestries and the decorative marble facades to reveal the naked, heavy, load-bearing pillars completely hidden beneath. Her hidden gift was a terrifying, magnificent form of pure intellectual sight that went vastly beyond the physical, visible world, entirely allowing her to flawlessly see the invisible, crushing threads of gravity and the massive, devastating weight of raw stone. She rapidly shaded the heavy foundational arches, rubbing the dark charcoal dust deeply into her rough skin as she mathematically, flawlessly calculated the massive, precise load distributions. She vividly remembered the loud, arrogant boasting of King Kalen from earlier that afternoon when he foolishly, proudly ordered a dozen massive, incredibly heavy iron cannons to be aggressively hauled directly to the highest roof of the southern tower to loudly intimidate his approaching enemies. The arrogant Alpha King completely blindly believed that massive, raw physical weight and heavy rusted steel automatically equaled absolute, undeniable supreme power. But Helen rigorously mathematically knew that the ancient mortar binding the lower eastern pillars was incredibly deeply compromised, completely weakened by decades of entirely ignored water damage from the adjacent rushing, freezing river. She rapidly, aggressively scribbled complex geometric equations along the rough, torn edge of the parchment, her brilliant calculating mind flawlessly simulating the massive, terrifying physical stress currently tearing through the ancient stone. She perfectly mathematically calculated the exact, devastating, crushing weight of the new heavy iron cannons, multiplying it by the steep, violent angle of the high stone roof and the severe structural weakness of the crumbling lower arches. The dark, precise lines on her parchment completely undeniably revealed a massive, horrifying mathematical certainty. The entire massive southern tower was absolutely not merely slowly decaying over time, it was actively, violently preparing to completely, catastrophically collapse at any given moment. Her charcoal snapped sharply, loudly against the rough parchment, leaving a thick, dark, jagged mark exactly where the primary load-bearing arch would violently, inevitably fail. It was an absolute, massive, fatal architectural trap entirely created by blind, arrogant military pride and toxic physical dominance. If the massive, heavy iron cannons remained on that high, vulnerable roof for even one more day, the entire towering stone structure would violently, brutally pancake directly downward, completely obliterating the Grand Military Council chambers located immediately below. Helen's heart hammered a frantic, heavy, terrifying rhythm against her small ribs as she stared completely paralyzed down at the flawless, meticulously drawn architectural blueprint. The sheer absolute magnitude of her practical engineering intellect was incredibly staggering, completely dynamically simulating the chaotic, devastating structural failure with absolute terrifying clinical accuracy. She actually held the absolute survival of the entire arrogant high court right here in her dirty, callous hands, completely hidden away in a freezing, damp cellar, where absolutely no one would ever appreciate her magnificent mind. She desperately, frantically wanted to run directly upstairs and loudly warn the massive Alpha King to completely aggressively drag him away from the doomed heavy stone structure before it became a massive bloody tomb. But the dark, agonizing, traumatic memories of her miserable past violently chained her small, fragile body entirely to the cold dirt floor. She knew absolutely perfectly well that if a lowly, invisible Omega dared to loudly interrupt the Supreme Royal Military Council with complex mathematical equations, she would absolutely never be praised as a magnificent, intelligent savior. She would be immediately violently dragged into the freezing open courtyard and brutally beaten for daring to publicly insult the fragile, massive pride of the highly decorated Alpha Commanders. The incredibly heavy, agonizing realization settled completely onto her small, fragile shoulders, crushing her with its massive, terrifying physical weight. She completely possessed the exact brilliant knowledge required to flawlessly save the massive, arrogant king who had just completely shattered her entire dignity. A terrifying, massive cliffhanger completely aggressively gripped the freezing, damp air as she suddenly felt a deep, low, violent, unnatural rumble echo completely through the solid stone floor beneath her worn cloth shoes, entirely perfectly confirming her terrifying mathematical prediction that the massive southern tower was absolutely violently beginning to tear itself apart right at this exact microsecond. The deep, violent rumble vibrating through the cold stone floor instantly violently dragged Helen backward into a deeply terrifying, traumatic memory. She closed her striking amber eyes, her frantic breathing growing incredibly shallow as the dark ghosts of her miserable past aggressively flooded the freezing alcove. It had happened exactly 10 agonizing years ago when she was just a small, fragile child, quietly watching her magnificent, brilliant father. Her father was an incredibly gifted Omega builder possessing the exact same terrifying, flawless intellectual sight that currently cursed her own mind. He had brilliantly, perfectly calculated a massive, fatal structural flaw in the Grand Eastern Bridge completely designed by the arrogant royal Alpha architects. Driven by a pure, desperate, naive hope to save innocent lives, her father had foolishly, respectfully presented his flawless mathematical blueprints directly to the High Military Council. The immediate, brutal reaction was not gratitude or honorable praise, but absolute, blinding, terrifying Alpha violence. The arrogant generals felt profoundly, violently insulted that a lowly, worthless Omega possessed a vastly superior intellectual understanding of physical engineering than their highly decorated royal builders. They did not merely dismiss his brilliant mind, they decided to completely, brutally, permanently destroy his entire spirit. Helen shuddered violently in the freezing dark cellar, her exhausted, fragile posture slumping forward as she vividly remembered the excruciating, bloody punishment. The heavily armored royal guards had violently dragged her weeping father into the freezing open courtyard directly in front of the entire laughing, cruel garrison. They forcefully, aggressively placed his magnificent, brilliant hands directly onto a heavy, flat stone anvil, entirely, completely shattering his delicate, creative fingers with a massive, heavy iron warhammer. The agonizing, deafening screams of her brilliant father had completely, permanently scarred her young, fragile soul. He was violently, brutally murdered just a few miserable weeks later, entirely broken by the cruel, massive, toxic pride of the Alpha world. Helen forcefully opened her amber eyes violently, completely pushing the dark, terrifying memory away from her highly logical mind. She stared down at her own small, calloused hands, completely, deeply stained with thick, dark charcoal dust, entirely realizing that she was perfectly, flawlessly repeating his exact, massive, tragic mistake. The arrogant King Kalen had just publicly, brutally rejected her mating bond and violently destroyed her blueprints, entirely proving that the massive, cruel Alpha world had absolutely not changed a single fraction. If she dared to run upstairs and loudly warn the arrogant king about the doomed southern towers, she would absolutely not be hailed as a magnificent, intelligent savior. She would be immediately, violently dragged to the exact same heavy stone anvil, and her own brilliant hands would be completely, entirely, brutally crushed into useless, bloody pulp. The massive, incredibly heavy realization completely settled onto her small, fragile shoulder. She absolutely, entirely refused to let her magnificent, brilliant mind be violently destroyed by men who worshipped nothing but hollow, rusted steel. She quickly, frantically gathered her small, precious pieces of rough charcoal and her heavily detailed architectural parchments, entirely stuffing them deeply into the ragged pockets of her thin canvas tube. She completely entirely abandoned her heavy wooden scrubbing buckets and her miserable slave existence, entirely refusing to die for a kingdom that treated her like worthless dirt. She moved with absolute terrifying flawless silence, completely slipping through the dark damp servant corridors like an invisible magnificent shadow. She mathematically flawlessly navigated the deeply hidden ancient drainage tunnels, completely entirely bypassing the heavily armored arrogant perimeter guards, who were entirely too busy loudly boasting to notice a single fleeing Omega. She emerged completely quietly into the freezing bitter night air, completely entirely leaving the massive towering Iron Keep directly behind her. She aggressively tightly pulled her thin ragged shawl around her freezing shoulders, her striking amber eyes burning with a massive beautiful unstoppable fire of pure absolute resolve. She would completely flawlessly travel far away to a distant rival province, entirely completely hiding her Omega scent and her fragile identity. She would absolutely magnificently build massive impenetrable soaring fortresses that would completely defy the ancient rigid laws of the entire known world, entirely proving that her breathtaking intellect was the absolute ultimate supreme power. But as her worn cloth shoes rapidly silently struck the soft dirt of the dark forest path, a sudden terrifying massive deafening physical roar violently completely shattered the quiet midnight sky. She slowly stopped and looked directly back over her fragile shoulder, completely entirely watching in absolute sheer profound horror as the massive heavy southern tower of the Iron Keep finally completely violently catastrophically collapsed into a massive blinding choking cloud of dark gray dust and shattered ancient stone, completely burying the arrogant royal court in their own massive ignorant grave. The massive deafening roar of the southern tower collapsing violently echoed through the thick choking night air, entirely swallowing the grand Iron Keep in a massive terrifying cloud of dark gray dust and shattered ancient stone. King Kalen lay violently thrown against the cracked marble floor of the grand courtyard, his incredibly heavy silver armor completely coated in a thick suffocating layer of dirty debris. His ears rang with a high-pitched agonizing whine, completely drowning out the frantic terrified screams of his surviving royal guards. He slowly, heavily pushed his massive muscular frame off the violently shaking ground, completely struggling to draw a single steady breath of the thick choking air. As the massive dark dust clouds slowly began to violently settle, the absolute terrifying magnitude of the catastrophic destruction was completely entirely revealed to his fierce dark eyes. The majestic towering southern structure, the absolute proudest symbol of his massive royal military power, was completely entirely gone, entirely replaced by a massive chaotic jagged mountain of broken rubble and twisted heavy. The dozen massive heavy iron cannons he had so arrogantly, foolishly ordered to be placed on the high vulnerable roof were now entirely buried deep within the dark bloody wreckage, entirely completely crushing the grand military council chambers below, exactly as the small fragile Omega had desperately tried to mathematically warn him. Kalen stared blindly at the massive, devastating destruction, his fierce, proud alpha soul completely violently shattering into a million tiny, irreparable pieces. His massive muscular arms, which had flawlessly, brutally conquered a dozen rival territories and swung the heaviest dark broadswords in the entire known world, hung completely, absolutely uselessly at his broadsides. He could not physically punch the shattered stone back into a high tower. He could not loudly, fiercely roar at the heavy, crushing gravity to reverse its devastating, violent pull. His absolute, legendary, raw physical might, the only massive power his arrogant, toxic court had ever worshipped, was incredibly, entirely pathetic and completely useless against the absolute, unyielding laws of physical engineering. A massive, sudden, agonizing realization violently, aggressively pierced directly through his heavy, dark chest. He vividly, intensely remembered the small, fragile Omega kneeling in the dirty, freezing mud earlier that exact same afternoon. He perfectly remembered the incredibly complex, detailed architectural blueprints she had desperately, frantically clutched in her small, callous hands. He had violently, aggressively snatched those brilliant, magnificent mathematical calculations from her trembling fingers and brutally thrown them entirely into the filthy dirt, loudly, arrogantly calling her a pathetic, fragile shadow. The bitter, agonizing taste of massive, profound regret flooded his dry, raw throat. She had completely, flawlessly, perfectly, mathematically predicted this exact, massive, devastating catastrophe. Her brilliant, magnificent mind had entirely, completely seen the invisible, deadly stress fractures and the failing ancient mortar that his highly decorated, arrogant royal builders had completely, entirely missed. She was absolutely not a weak, useless burden. She was an unparalleled master architect of breathtaking genius, and he had entirely, brutally, cruelly driven her away with his massive, toxic, blind pride. Commander Thorne, his heavily armored, loyal captain, stumbled violently through the thick, choking dust, his scarred face completely pale with absolute, pure, terrifying panic. "My King," Thorne gasped, desperately coughing up dark gray ash. "The massive, entire southern defensive wall has been completely, entirely compromised by the violent collapse. The heavy structural integrity of the main iron gate is absolutely failing. The entire massive fortress is incredibly totally vulnerable to a direct massive frontal assault. Kalen fiercely snapped his dark eyes toward the wide gaping jagged hole where the massive towering defensive wall had once proudly stood. The freezing bitter night wind howled aggressively directly through the massive broken breach, entirely carrying the incredibly terrifying distant sound of deep heavy rhythmic war horn. The rival Eastern Army's highly aggressive, brutal scavengers who had completely patiently waited in the dark freezing shadows for decades had instantly perfectly heard the massive deafening roar of the collapsing tower. They absolutely knew the majestic iron keep was completely violently broken. The heavy, terrifying, rhythmic beating of thousands of marching enemy boots began to faintly echo across the dark, frozen valley directly towards the completely shattered open fortress. Kalen frantically, fiercely ordered his terrified surviving soldiers to quickly, aggressively form a massive defensive shield wall across the jagged, broken rubble, entirely, completely knowing deep in his agonizing soul that it was an absolutely futile, pathetic gesture. His highly decorated, arrogant generals who had laughed so cruelly at the quiet Omega were now completely frantically running in absolute terrifying chaotic circles, entirely unable to comprehend the massive complex structural failure. They desperately, loudly yelled completely useless military tactics, entirely trying to solve a massive, highly complex physical engineering crisis with blind, raw, aggressive force. The towering iron keep was slowly, painfully bleeding out, completely, entirely exposed to the brutal, violent. Kalen stood completely, absolutely helpless amidst the massive, devastating ruins, his massive, heavy silver crown, feeling like a crushing, burning iron cage completely trapping his arrogant mind. He desperately looked down at the dark, dirty mud, exactly where he had so brutally, violently crushed her flawless, brilliant blueprints. The massive, majestic kingdom he had spent his entire bloody, violent life aggressively building was completely, entirely turning to dark, worthless dust directly slipping through his massive, scarred fingers. He absolutely, desperately, utterly needed her. He entirely, completely needed the magnificent, brilliant architectural mind of the small, fragile Omega he had so cruelly, publicly humiliated. But the dark, freezing night was completely, absolutely empty, and the massive, heavy war horns of his approaching enemies grew incredibly, terrifyingly louder, violently, entirely signaling the absolute, complete, brutal end of his arrogant, blind reign, unless he could somehow miraculously find the brilliant master builder he had so foolishly, violently kept. The bitter, freezing wind whipped violently across the jagged eastern mountain pass as Alpha King Kalen rode heavily toward the distant rival province of the Silver Ridge. He was absolutely no longer the proud, arrogant conqueror who had fiercely, loudly demanded the absolute, total submission of the entire known world. He was a completely broken, desperate man, wearing heavily dented, dirty silver armor, riding a severely exhausted war horse. Behind him rode Commander Thorn and a small, heavily armed contingent of his most fiercely loyal surviving guards, their massive, heavy heads bowed in profound, dark shame. The majestic, towering iron keep they had proudly, fiercely sworn to protect was completely, entirely reduced to a massive, chaotic graveyard of shattered, ancient stone and twisted, heavy iron. They had entirely, completely left their completely broken home, incredibly, hopelessly vulnerable to the massive, advancing enemy armies, frantically seeking the absolute, only magnificent salvation that could possibly quickly rebuild their massive, shattered defensive walls. Rumors had rapidly, fiercely spread across the dark, freezing valleys of an absolutely legendary supreme master architect residing entirely within the peaceful Silver Ridge province. The frantic, desperate scouts spoke in absolute, pure, staggering awe of a magnificent, brilliant builder who could flawlessly, mathematically command the very heavy earth and massive raw stone to completely bend entirely to their absolute sovereign will. Kalen completely, blindly assumed this magnificent, legendary architect was an incredibly ancient, highly experienced alpha, a massive, heavy man who had spent decades fiercely, rigorously mastering the complex, brutal science of physical siege warfare. He desperately, completely, entirely planned to humbly, violently beg this massive, legendary master to rapidly travel back to the ruined Iron Keep, entirely, completely willing to pay any massive, exorbitant price in solid, heavy royal gold. As the severely exhausted royal party slowly, heavily crested the final high, jagged, snowy ridge, the massive, thick, freezing fog finally completely, beautifully parted. Kalen fiercely pulled back on his heavy leather reins, his massive warhorse heavily, aggressively stopping in the deep white snow. The massive, imposing Alpha King completely, entirely froze, his fierce, dark eyes widening in absolute, pure, sheer, breathtaking astonishment. The magnificent, towering structure rising perfectly, completely, flawlessly from the deep, jagged valley below was absolutely, completely unlike any massive, heavy stone fortress he had ever seen in his entire violent, bloody life. It did not aggressively, foolishly fight against the massive, heavy natural mountain like his arrogant, ruined Iron Keep had. Instead, it completely flawlessly harmoniously blended directly into the high steep cliffs, entirely perfectly utilizing the massive raw heavy stone as an absolute impenetrable natural shield. The towering soaring walls were incredibly beautifully curved, mathematically flawlessly designed to completely deflect massive heavy siege boulders and violent direct artillery strikes. The massive high load-bearing arches were incredibly perfectly spaced, displaying an absolute magnificent terrifying mastery of physical gravity and massive structural tension. It was an absolute breathtaking flawless masterpiece of supreme civil engineering, completely defying all ancient rigid traditional laws of heavy raw physical construction. Kalen's massive chest heaved violently as he stared deeply down at the magnificent soaring fortress, feeling an incredibly profound massive wave of complete absolute pure humility aggressively wash over his fierce proud dark soul. He immediately mathematically instantly recognized that the incredibly brilliant magnificent mind that had flawlessly designed this absolute towering masterpiece was completely vastly superior to any loud aggressive heavily decorated royal builder he had ever foolishly violently employed. The massive towering walls did not rely on blind raw physical weight or heavy rusted iron. They relied absolutely, completely, entirely on pure, perfect, rigorous mathematical truth. Every single massive, heavy block of smooth, polished stone was perfectly placed to entirely absorb and brilliantly, flawlessly redistribute the massive, crushing weight of the high, soaring towers. The entire massive structure radiated an absolute, undeniable, quiet, supreme sovereign power that completely, effortlessly, entirely dwarfed his own massive, legendary physical strength. Commander Thorne rode heavily slowly up beside the entirely stunned Alpha King, his highly scarred face completely pale with absolute profound staggering awe. By the ancient gods, Thorne whispered, his deep raspy voice trembling violently in the freezing cold wind, this magnificent massive structure is completely, absolutely, entirely unbreakable. We could fiercely, violently siege this high towering fortress with 100,000 heavily armored men for 10 agonizing bleeding years, and we would absolutely never scratch the lowest foundations. Kalen slowly heavily nodded, his fierce proud alpha heart, completely entirely surrendering to the massive undeniable absolute truth of the brilliant magnificent architect. He had proudly foolishly spent his entire violent bloody life aggressively heavily destroying massive beautiful things, completely blindly believing that raw brutal physical force was the absolute only true power in the massive harsh world. But looking deeply down at the absolutely flawless, impenetrable soaring walls of the Silver Ridge Fortress, he completely entirely understood that true magnificent, everlasting power was absolutely entirely born from deep, profound, quiet, intellectual creation. The small, heavily armored, desperate royal party slowly, heavily rode down the steep, winding mountain path, completely entirely approaching the massive, heavy iron gates of the magnificent fortress. Kalen felt a massive, heavy, incredibly anxious knot violently, aggressively, completely tighten in his dark, aching chest. He absolutely, entirely, completely needed this magnificent, legendary master architect to completely, immediately save his severely broken, dying kingdom. He was absolutely, entirely prepared to completely, entirely swallow his massive, fierce alpha pride, to aggressively, violently throw himself directly onto his heavily armored knees and humbly, desperately beg for absolute physical salvation. He completely mentally prepared his incredibly desperate, humble speech, perfectly flawlessly planning to highly respectfully address the incredibly brilliant ancient alpha master builder. He heavily, entirely dismounted, his exhausted massive warhorse slowly heavily handing the thick, heavy leather reins to Commander Thorne. The massive, heavy, perfect iron gates slowly, smoothly, silently opened, completely inviting the incredibly desperate, broken Alpha King directly into the warm, glowing, magnificent grand courtyard. A small, polite, formally dressed attendant quickly, gracefully approached, entirely, completely, leading the highly anxious, massive king directly toward the highest, most magnificent soaring structure in the entire fortress, the incredibly grand elite drafting hall. Kalen's massive heavy boots clicked loudly, nervously against the flawless polished marble floors, his dark fierce eyes completely anxiously looking entirely ahead. But a massive, terrifying, incredibly beautiful, profound cliffhanger entirely violently aggressively gripped the tense warm air, as Kalen slowly heavily stepped directly into the magnificent grand drafting hall, completely absolutely entirely unaware that the magnificent legendary master waiting perfectly quietly for him on the high grand throne was absolutely completely not an ancient alpha man, but the exact incredibly fragile, severely abused Omega he had so brutally violently humiliated and entirely discarded into the freezing filthy mud. The heavy, intricately carved oak doors of the grand drafting hall smoothly, silently glided open completely entirely, welcoming the desperate royal party into the massive towering room was an absolute breathtaking sanctuary of pure rigorous intellectual worship, completely entirely devoid of heavy rusted iron swords or loud aggressive military shouting. Tall, magnificent stained glass windows allowed massive, brilliant rays of warm golden sunlight to perfectly illuminate dozens of massive, heavy wooden tables, completely entirely covered in highly complex geographical maps and incredibly detailed structural models. Hundreds of quietly, rigorously studying scholars and highly skilled apprentices moved smoothly, gracefully through the bright, airy room, speaking in hushed, deeply respectful tones, completely entirely dedicating their brilliant minds to the absolute magnificent science of physical creation. Kalen's massive, heavy boots felt incredibly loud, completely entirely out of place in this magnificent, peaceful, intellectual haven. He felt entirely like a massive, clumsy, violent beast carelessly intruding upon a sacred, pristine temple. He nervously, tightly gripped his heavy silver helmet under his massive, muscular arm, his highly scarred face pale with intense, terrifying anxiety. He completely, frantically, mentally rehearsed his incredibly desperate, humble speech, perfectly, flawlessly planning to highly respectfully address the incredibly brilliant ancient alpha master builder he entirely blindly assumed was waiting for him. He heavily, slowly stepped entirely forward, his fierce, dark eyes completely, intensely scanning the massive, bright room, desperately, frantically searching for the massive, heavy old man who could miraculously entirely save his entirely broken, bleeding kingdom. The overwhelming, incredibly sharp scent of fresh, rich ink and smooth, heavy parchment completely dominated the warm air, directly, aggressively replacing the bitter, horrible stench of blood and burning ash that he had tragically, violently left behind at his dying, ruined fortress. At the absolute precise center of the magnificent grand hall, sitting perfectly elevated upon a beautifully, intricately carved, heavy oak chair that served as the absolute, undeniable master builder throne, sat the supreme, legendary architect. Kalen fiercely looked up, his massive, heavy heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his broad ribs, completely prepared to violently, aggressively throw himself directly onto his heavily armored knees to desperately beg for physical salvation. But as his fierce, dark eyes completely, entirely locked onto the magnificent, quiet figure, sitting proudly on the high wooden throne, his massive, muscular legs absolutely, completely, entirely froze, completely, perfectly glued to the polished marble floor. The incredibly heavy, massive breath was violently, completely, violently punched directly out of his broad chest, entirely, completely, leaving him violently gasping an absolute, pure, sheer, profound, breathtaking shock. The supreme, legendary master architect, absolutely, flawlessly commanding this magnificent, massive intellectual empire, was completely, entirely, absolutely not a massive, heavy, ancient alpha man. It was Helen. She was absolutely no longer the pathetic, severely abused, invisible servant girl, violently forced to rigidly scrub freezing, dirty stone floors and ragged, torn canvas. She sat perfectly, flawlessly straight, radiating an absolute, undeniable, supreme sovereign authority, wearing a magnificent, highly elegant, tailored gown of deep, rich sapphire blue, completely, entirely, perfectly reflecting the brilliant, magnificent depth of her unparalleled mind. Her incredibly beautiful, striking amber eyes, which used to constantly, fearfully look down at the filthy mud, were now fiercely, brilliantly locked entirely, directly onto his pale, heavily scarred face, completely, entirely devoid of any terrified, weak submission. Her small, delicate hands, absolutely no longer heavily stained with thick gray ash and bitter lye, gracefully, smoothly held a magnificent, heavy, solid gold drafting compass, completely, undeniably, entirely marking her as the absolute supreme master of the grand, massive fortress. The incredibly heavy golden chains of high office beautifully, gracefully draped across her delicate collarbones, silently, loudly proving that this rival province completely, entirely worshipped her magnificent, brilliant mind. The incredibly massive, agonizing realization violently, aggressively crashed directly over King Kalen, heavy, dark soul completely, entirely, violently shattering the last remaining fragile pieces of his massive, toxic alpha pride. The incredibly brilliant, magnificent, legendary builder who had flawlessly, perfectly designed the absolute most impenetrable, towering, massive fortress in the entire known world. The absolute, completely, entirely only supreme genius who could possibly miraculously save his bleeding, dying people from absolute, brutal, bloody annihilation was the exact, entirely fragile Omega he had so brutally, violently, publicly humiliated and completely discarded into the freezing, filthy dirt. Commander Thorne and the heavily armored royal guards standing directly, entirely behind him, collectively, completely, violently gasped in absolute, pure, staggering, terrified disbelief. Their massive, heavy jaws dropping completely open as they simultaneously, mathematically realized the horrific, devastating magnitude of their past cruel, arrogant blindness. Kalen stood completely, entirely, paralyzed, entirely, violently, trembling in his heavy, dirty silver armor, completely, absolutely trapped in a massive, agonizing, suffocating nightmare of his own massive, foolish, violent creation. The violently severed sacred golden mating bond that he had so proudly, violently, fiercely rejected in the grand courtyard suddenly, violently, completely roared back, to agonizing, terrifying life, completely fiercely screaming in his rushing dark blood, entirely fiercely painfully demanding absolute, profound submission to her magnificent, brilliant intellect. He had loudly, arrogantly demanded a fierce, massive warrior queen, completely foolishly, violently throwing away the absolute, magnificent, supreme goddess of the earth, who could flawlessly, mathematically command the very heavy stone beneath his boots. His past cruel words violently, viciously echoed in his ringing ears, violently punishing his bleeding soul. Helen slowly, gracefully, elegantly placed her heavy solid gold compass directly onto the massive smooth drafting table, entirely perfectly breaking the incredibly heavy, agonizing, suffocating silence of the magnificent grand hall. She did not violently, angrily scream or loudly, fiercely demand his immediate brutal execution. She completely, calmly, coldly looked deeply down at the massive, broken Alpha King, her brilliant, magnificent, calculating mind entirely, perfectly, flawlessly reading the absolute, massive, devastating, terrifying desperation violently burning in his dark, fierce eyes. She absolutely knew perfectly, flawlessly why the massive, terrifying king of the Iron Keep had desperately traveled to her safe, peaceful province. A massive, terrifying, incredibly profound, beautiful cliffhanger, completely, entirely, violently, aggressively gripped the extremely tense, bright, airy room as the absolute most terrifying, fiercely powerful alpha warrior in the entire massive known world completely, undeniably realized that his absolute, entire, royal, miserable, bloody existence now perfectly, completely, flawlessly rested entirely in the small, delicate, callous hands of the brilliant woman he had once loudly, arrogantly called completely worthless dust. The massive, heavy iron gates of the ruined Iron Keep groaned violently as the royal procession finally returned to the shattered fortress. Helen sat perfectly upright on a magnificent white warhorse, her deep sapphire gown contrasting sharply with the thick gray ash and dark mud, completely covering the devastated courtyard. She looked at the massive, catastrophic ruins of the southern tower where thousands of heavy, jagged stones lay violently scattered like broken teeth. This was the exact miserable place where she had been brutally forced to scrub the freezing, dirty floors on her hands and knees, entirely invisible and heavily abused. But she did not return as a pathetic, fragile servant. She returned as the absolute supreme master architect, completely holding the entire physical salvation of the massive kingdom in her delicate, calloused hands. King Kalen rode directly beside her, his massive, heavily armored warhorse, completely keeping perfect pace with hers. He did not proudly ride ahead to loudly claim his royal dominance. He deliberately, carefully maintained his massive physical position slightly behind her, completely visually signaling to the entire terrified surviving court that she was now the absolute highest sovereign authority. The surviving royal guards and the heavily decorated, arrogant generals stood amidst the smoking rubble, their heavily scarred faces completely pale with absolute sheer terror and profound, staggering disbelief. You're listening to this story on the Alpha King Secrets channel. Are you enjoying today's story? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Now, let's get back to the story. They entirely remembered the quiet Omega they had so cruelly mocked and violently kicked into the freezing mud. Now they stared up at her magnificent, striking amber eyes, entirely realizing she held their absolute, entire survival. General Fenwick, the most fiercely arrogant commander of the royal vanguard, stepped aggressively forward, his thick hands violently gripping his heavy broadsword. He opened his massive mouth to loudly, fiercely protest the absolute sheer indignity of taking military construction orders from a fragile Omega. But before a single cruel word could violently escape his raw throat, Kalen completely, violently, aggressively spurred his massive warhorse directly forward, entirely placing his massive, heavily armored body directly between the arrogant general and his magnificent queen. If you dare to speak a single disrespectful syllable to the Supreme Master Architect Fenwick, Kalen roared, his incredibly deep, raspy voice echoing with absolute, pure, terrifying, murderous fury. I will personally violently sever your arrogant head from your massive shoulders and permanently mount it on the shattered eastern wall. You will entirely, completely, blindly follow her absolute every single mathematical command, or you will brutally perish in the freezing dark dirt. The massive, fierce Alpha King completely, entirely, physically enforced her brilliant intellectual rule, absolutely ensuring that her magnificent mind was completely, heavily protected by his massive, raw physical strength. The heavy, arrogant generals entirely, immediately, violently swallowed their massive, toxic pride, dropping heavily to their injured knees in the dirty gray ash, completely, totally submitting to the brilliant Omega they had once called completely worthless dust. Helen slowly, gracefully dismounted her warhorse, completely, entirely ignoring the dirty gray mud, heavily staining the hem of her beautiful sapphire gown. She did not fiercely shout or loudly, aggressively boast. She smoothly, gracefully unrolled a massive, incredibly complex architectural blueprint, completely spreading the heavy parchment directly over a large, flat piece of shattered marble. The brilliant, magnificent rebuilding of the massive kingdom had completely, officially begun. She began to flawlessly mathematically direct the massive heavily armored soldiers, entirely perfectly calculating the exact structural stress points of the heavy collapsed rubble. She flawlessly, precisely instructed the massive muscular warriors exactly where to safely insert their heavy iron levers and precisely how to safely haul away the massive jagged stones without causing further deadly structural collapses. Her brilliant, calculating mind operated at a terrifying, breathtaking speed, completely effortlessly managing thousands of heavy physical laborers simultaneously. Kalen entirely completely removed his heavy silver royal cape and violently threw his heavy silver crown directly onto a broken stone, entirely stripping away his massive arrogant royal status. He grabbed a massive heavy iron lever and marched directly into the freezing, dirty mud, entirely flawlessly executing her complex mathematical instructions alongside his heavily armored men. He was completely, entirely, absolutely nothing but the physical heavy muscle entirely dedicated to executing her magnificent, flawless vision. He heaved the massive, heavy, jagged stones with his incredible raw physical strength, completely sweating in the freezing, bitter wind, but his dark, fierce eyes constantly, intensely, completely, entirely drifted back to Helen. He watched her small, delicate hands smoothly, effortlessly marking the complex architectural blueprints, entirely mesmerized by the absolute sheer magnificent brilliance of her mind. When the bitter freezing wind violently, aggressively whipped across the ruined courtyard, Kalen immediately dropped his heavy iron tools and quickly, heavily walked to her side. He gently, softly draped his thick, warm, heavy fur cloak completely, entirely over her fragile, freezing shoulders, his massive, scarred hands lingering incredibly softly against her delicate collarbone. The simple, profound, entirely intimate gesture completely sent a massive, rushing electric shock entirely directly through their completely reawakened mating bond. Helen slowly looked up from her heavy, complex blueprints, her striking amber eyes entirely completely meeting his intense, burning, dark gaze. She saw no massive, toxic alpha arrogance, no cruel, blind physical dominance. She saw only absolute, pure, profound, eternal devotion and a massive, heavy physical warrior completely, entirely, utterly humbled by her magnificent intellect. The slow, beautiful, burning romance completely flawlessly blossomed amidst the freezing dark ruins, entirely perfectly built upon a massive solid foundation of absolute profound mutual respect, entirely permanently replacing the massive heavy crushing cruelty of their deeply broken past. The thick freezing night completely enveloped the ruined courtyard of the Iron Keep. But inside the massive temporary royal command tent, a warm, brilliant golden light brightly, fiercely burned. Helen stood leaning heavily over a massive, rough wooden drafting table, her striking amber eyes intensely, completely scanning an incredibly complex, highly detailed blueprint of the new eastern defensive perimeter. The heavy, exhausting physical labor of the long, brutal day ached deeply in her fragile bones, but her magnificent, brilliant mind was completely, aggressively awake, operating at an absolutely terrifying, flawless speed. She rapidly, gracefully moved her heavy, solid gold compass across the thick parchment, meticulously, mathematically calculating the exact massive physical tension required to completely, perfectly support the newly designed towering iron reinforced stone arches. She absolutely, entirely refused to let the bleeding, dying kingdom violently fall to the massive approaching eastern armies. She was entirely, completely rebuilding the massive, arrogant world directly into a magnificent, breathtaking masterpiece of supreme structural integrity. The heavy, thick canvas flap of the large command tent slowly, quietly pushed open, letting in a brief, sharp bite of the bitter, freezing mountain wind. Kalen quietly, heavily stepped into the warm, glowing light, entirely ducking his massive, towering head to flawlessly avoid the low, thick wooden support beams. He absolutely no longer wore his massive, heavy silver crown or his highly decorated, arrogant royal cape. He wore simple, thick, dark leather armor heavily stained with the dark gray mud and bitter, thick ash from his brutal, exhausting physical labor in the freezing, ruined courtyard. He gently, carefully carried a small, steaming silver cup of hot spice wine, holding the delicate metal incredibly softly in his massive, thick, heavily scarred hands as if it were an entirely priceless, fragile treasure. He slowly, quietly walked directly toward her, his massive, heavy boots entirely deliberately making absolutely no aggressive, loud sounds on the flat wooden floorboards, completely, perfectly ensuring he did not violently disturb her intense, brilliant focus. He stopped completely closely right beside her, pouring a massive, overwhelming wave of absolute, pure, raw, radiating body heat directly into her freezing, exhausted frame. Helen slowly, deeply inhaled the incredibly rich, intoxicating scent of dark cedar and deep, heavy rain, perfectly recognizing the incredibly powerful, soothing presence of her fierce alpha mate. The violently severed golden mating bond, which had once caused her such profound, absolute, agonizing pain, now deeply, warmly, fiercely, hummed perfectly, flawlessly, bridging the quiet, beautiful space between their perfect. Kalen gently, softly placed the steaming silver cup directly next to her heavy gold compass. You must completely deeply rest your magnificent brilliant mind, Helen. He whispered, his incredibly deep raspy voice wrapping entirely perfectly around her exhausted fragile shoulders like a thick warm protective blanket. The massive heavy raw stone will entirely completely wait for the bright morning sun, but your beautiful fragile body absolutely needs warm physical nourishment. Helen slowly gracefully turned her head intensely, looking directly up into his dark fierce eyes. She saw absolutely zero massive toxic alpha pride or blind aggressive military dominance. She entirely saw a massive physical warrior completely utterly devoted to her supreme intellectual grace. She slowly smoothly pointed her small callous finger directly at the massive complex mathematical equations heavily drawn on the rough thick parchment. The massive Eastern armies use heavy brutal iron siege engines. Kaelin, she stated, her smooth voice carrying an absolute undeniable quiet sovereign authority. If we completely build the lower foundation using the traditional massive rigid square blocks, they will violently physically shatter the massive heavy stone within 3 agonizing days. We absolutely must build the massive high walls using a complex mathematically curved interlocking structure completely perfectly designed to flawlessly absorb and smoothly redirect the massive violent crushing physical impact directly down into the deep heavy earth. Kaelin leaned his massive heavily muscular frame perfectly directly over the large drafting table, his broad thick shoulder incredibly gently softly brushing entirely directly against hers. He intensely deeply studied the highly complex architectural drawing, entirely flawlessly trusting her magnificent brilliant mind, vastly more than his own massive heavily decorated military experience. It is an absolute, entirely breathtaking, flawless masterpiece, he murmured deeply, his massive thick chest violently heavily rumbling with pure, absolute, profound awe. You entirely perceive the massive hidden physical universe in a magnificent, beautiful way that my heavy, blind, arrogant eyes could absolutely never possibly comprehend. I completely, deeply submit my absolute raw physical strength entirely to your flawless, magnificent mathematical vision. His heavily scarred hand slowly, incredibly gently reached out perfectly softly, entirely brushing a stray dark lock of hair completely away from her beautifully tired face. His gentle, intensely physical touch sent a massive, breathtaking, violent spark of pure, brilliant, romantic fire entirely aggressively directly down her incredibly sensitive spine, completely flawlessly confirming his absolute, deep, eternal devotion. But the deeply, profoundly beautiful, intoxicating, slow-burning romantic moment was suddenly violently entirely shattered by a massive, horrifying, terrifying realization perfectly mathematically forming in her brilliant, calculating mind. Helen quickly, fiercely looked directly back down at the massive, heavy structural reports recently heavily submitted by the arrogant, elite Royal Vanguard commanders earlier that exact same. Her striking amber eyes flawlessly, perfectly, mathematically registered a massive, catastrophic, highly deliberate structural discrepancy in the heavy physical load calculations entirely regarding the main central defensive bridge. A massive, terrifying, incredibly cold, agonizing cliffhanger entirely violently gripped the warm, tense command tent as Helen absolutely mathematically realized that the highly decorated, arrogant royal generals were not simply entirely making foolish, ignorant architectural mistakes, but were entirely, actively, maliciously, deliberately, mathematically sabotaging the massive critical defensive structure, perfectly, flawlessly planning to completely, brutally murder their brilliant new architect queen. The pale morning sun barely broke through the heavy, thick gray clouds hanging ominously over the shattered ruins of the Iron Keep, but the massive temporary construction site was already completely, fiercely alive with deafening noise. Helen marched entirely confidently across the muddy courtyard, her dark sapphire gown entirely replaced by highly practical, thick leather riding trousers and a heavy, durable wool tunic. Her small, calloused hands tightly gripped the heavy rolled parchment containing the exact mathematical proof of the deliberate, violent sabotage she had flawlessly discovered in the dark command tent the previous night. She did not entirely blindly run to Alpha King Kaelin to desperately beg for his massive physical protection. She absolutely entirely refused to cower like a pathetic, invisible servant ever again. She was the absolute supreme master architect, and she would completely, fiercely, mathematically defend her magnificent, towering creation with her own undeniable sovereign authority. She walked directly, aggressively toward the massive central defensive bridge, exactly where the highly decorated, arrogant Royal Vanguard was currently loudly, violently hauling massive, heavy stones. The incredibly sharp, freezing wind violently whipped her dark hair across her beautifully fierce face, but she did not even flinch. Her striking amber eyes completely, intensely locked onto the massive lower foundational trench, completely, flawlessly, instantly registering the massive, horrifying physical reality of their treason. General Fenwick and his heavy, loyal elite commanders were deliberately, completely ignoring her incredibly complex, interlocking, curved designs entirely, forcefully, aggressively, placing the highly unstable, rigid square blocks directly into the massive critical load-bearing positions. "Stop this massive construction immediately," Helen commanded, her incredibly smooth voice ringing out with such absolute, undeniable, terrifying intellectual authority that the heavy, exhausting physical labor violently ground to an absolute sudden halt. The massive, heavily armored soldiers entirely froze, their heavy, thick iron levers completely resting against the jagged, raw stone, entirely looking nervously between the small, fragile Omega and their towering, arrogant Alpha commander. General Fenwick slowly, heavily turned, his massive, scarred face violently twisting into a deeply ugly, cruel sneer of absolute, pure, toxic disgust. He deliberately, aggressively dropped his heavy iron mallet and marched heavily, threateningly, directly toward her, his massive, heavily armored chest violently, completely, physically towering over her small, delicate frame. He entirely, completely attempted to use his massive, raw, brutal physical size to violently, aggressively intimidate her, exactly as the cruel overseers used to do when she was nothing but completely worthless dust scrubbing the freezing, dirty floors. "You absolutely dare to loudly interrupt the royal vanguard, fragile little shadow," Fenwick spat, his deep, heavy voice dripping with massive, pure, arrogant venom. "We are highly decorated elite warriors of the Iron Keep, absolutely, completely, not pathetic, submissive bricklayers entirely violently forced to blindly follow the childish, useless scribbles of a weak, worthless Omega. Your completely ridiculous curved stones are mathematically impossible to rapidly, safely stack, and we entirely, completely refuse to waste our massive, heavy physical strength playing your foolish, delicate architectural game." Helen completely, entirely refused to physically step back. She stood absolutely, perfectly, flawlessly still, her magnificent, brilliant mind operating at a terrifying, breathtaking speed, entirely, perfectly, mathematically calculating the exact, devastating physical failure his arrogant ignorance would inevitably violently cause. She did not fiercely, loudly scream or frantically, emotionally weep. She completely, flawlessly, calmly unrolled her massive, heavy parchment, completely, flawlessly pointing her small, callous finger directly at the massive, heavy square blocks currently resting dangerously, entirely in the deep, muddy trench. "You're completely, mathematically, deliberately destroying the absolute only massive critical defensive structure that can possibly miraculously physically support the massive heavy iron gates," Fenwick, she stated coldly, her striking amber eyes violently burning with absolute, pure, undeniable sovereign fire. "If you completely, heavily build that central foundational arch using those highly rigid, unstable stones, the very first massive, heavy kinetic impact from an Eastern siege engine will entirely, violently shatter the lower load-bearing pillars completely, instantly, aggressively sending the entire massive defensive bridge violently crashing directly into the freezing, rushing river below. You're completely, absolutely, not loudly, proudly protecting this bleeding, dying kingdom. You're deliberately, mathematically, physically murdering every single heavily armored soldier who will tragically, bravely stand upon that doomed structure." The heavy, dark truth of her flawless mathematical words completely, violently, aggressively echoed across the freezing, muddy courtyard entirely, causing the massive, heavily armored soldiers to slowly, anxiously step back from the highly unstable deep. The massive, thick face of General Fenwick violently flushed a deep, highly dangerous crimson, entirely, completely realizing that his highly deliberate, massive, lethal architectural trap had been absolutely, perfectly, flawlessly exposed by the exact fragile Omega he so brutally, deeply despised. He fiercely, aggressively, tightly clenched his heavy, thick, heavily scarred fists, his massive, toxic, arrogant alpha pride completely, violently demanding brutal, immediate physical retribution against her magnificent, supreme intellect. King Kalen suddenly, heavily, powerfully emerged from the dark morning fog, his massive, heavy silver broadsword firmly, securely strapped to his broad, muscular back, his fierce, dark eyes violently, completely, intensely sweeping the highly tense, silent construction site. He completely, flawlessly, instantly recognized the massive, highly dangerous, absolute physical threat violently, aggressively radiating directly from his arrogant elite commander, entirely moving his massive muscular frame quickly, heavily, directly toward his magnificent, brilliant queen. But Fenwick immediately, completely, deceptively, flawlessly dropped his massive, aggressive, violent posture entirely, forcefully, violently, forcing a horribly fake, heavy, submissive bow directly toward the dirty gray mud. He completely, falsely, loudly declared that his elite men were merely tragically, blindly ignorant of her highly complex mathematical engineering, completely, absolutely, entirely promising to immediately, flawlessly, violently correct the massive, heavy structural error. The fierce, dark eyes of King Kalen violently, intensely narrowed, absolutely, deeply, entirely distrusting the massive, arrogant commander, but Helen slowly, gracefully, elegantly nodded her beautiful dark head, completely allowing the massive physical labor to cautiously, safely resume. But a massive, terrifying, incredibly dangerous, violent cliffhanger completely aggressively gripped the cold, freezing morning air as Helen completely, entirely, absolutely mathematically realized that the massive, arrogant general was flawlessly, deceptively, entirely steering her directly toward the high, entirely unstable upper wooden scaffolding, perfectly flawlessly planning to completely, brutally, violently trap her high above the rushing, freezing river during the massive, critical royal inspection. The freezing wind howled violently through the deep, jagged gorge as Helen and King Kaelin carefully stepped out onto the high wooden scaffolding completely suspended over the massive rushing river. The incredibly steep, terrifying drop was profoundly dizzying, but Helen completely, entirely ignored the massive, fatal height, her striking amber eyes absolutely, entirely, intensely focused on the highly complex structural joints of the massive central defensive bridge. She carried her heavy, solid gold compass and a thick roll of detailed architectural parchment, her brilliant calculating mind flawlessly mathematically verifying every single heavy iron bolt and massive wooden support beam. King Kaelin walked heavily closely directly behind her, his massive, heavily armored body completely physically shielding her fragile frame from the bitter, biting, freezing wind. He entirely, completely trusted her magnificent intellect, absolutely, perfectly, flawlessly willing to follow her directly into the most highly dangerous physical situations. But down below in the freezing, muddy, dirty courtyard, General Fenwick and his arrogant elite military commanders watched with massive, cold, toxic anticipation, their deeply cruel eyes entirely perfectly tracking the royal couple high above the deadly, freezing, rushing water. Helen slowly, gracefully knelt on the rough wooden planks, her small, callous fingers gently, carefully tracing the heavy, thick iron brackets perfectly, flawlessly designed to hold the massive primary load of the central arch. Her highly logical, brilliant mind suddenly, violently, aggressively registered a massive, terrifying physical inconsistency. The incredibly heavy, thick iron linchpins, completely, absolutely critical for maintaining the massive structural tension, were entirely, completely missing, deeply, secretly, violently removed during the chaotic dark night. She mathematically, instantly realized that the massive, heavy support ropes holding the entire high wooden platform had been completely, deliberately, secretly slashed entirely, leaving the massive high structure hanging by incredibly fragile, violently tearing threads. The dark, toxic alpha generals had entirely, completely, perfectly used her massive, brilliant dedication to the kingdom exactly against her, flawlessly, perfectly luring her directly onto the highly compromised, fatal structure. Helen Hart hammered a frantic, heavy, terrifying rhythm against her ribs as she flawlessly, mathematically realized they had walked entirely, completely, blindly, directly into a massive, highly lethal architectural trap. Kaelin, she whispered sharply, her smooth voice completely, entirely cutting through the loud, howling wind, stepped completely, slowly, carefully, directly backward toward the massive, solid stone foundation right now. But before the massive Alpha King could physically, heavily react to her highly urgent, terrifying warning, the bitter, freezing wind violently, aggressively, completely whipped across the deep, dark gorge. The massively, deliberately weakened, heavy support ropes violently, completely snapped with a deafening, terrifying crack echoing like massive, roaring thunder across the high, jagged cliffs. The massive, heavy wooden scaffolding violently, violently lurched directly, completely forward, entirely, completely, instantly, dropping several terrifying feet into the freezing, empty air. Helen completely, entirely lost her physical footing. Her small, fragile body violently, aggressively, completely thrown toward the massive, deadly, rushing river, entirely waiting far below. Kaelin roared with absolute, pure, terrifying alpha fury, his massive, heavily muscular body completely, violently lunging forward with incredible, breathtaking physical speed. His massive, thick, heavily scarred hands shot out completely, aggressively, fiercely, violently grabbing her delicate, fragile wrist just as she entirely slipped completely off the jagged, broken wooden edge. The massive, heavy, immense physical shock of her sudden, violent drop completely, aggressively tore through his broad, thick shoulder, but he entirely, absolutely refused to let her fragile body fall. He completely, heavily, violently threw his massive, raw physical weight completely directly backward, entirely, brutally slamming his heavily armored chest against the remaining, highly unstable wooden beams. He held her completely, perfectly, entirely suspended over the massive, terrifying drop, his incredibly fierce, dark eyes violently, completely burning with massive, pure, absolute protective desperation. "I absolutely, completely have you," he fiercely, heavily roared, the massive, thick veins entirely, violently popping in his thick, massive, muscular neck. But the highly massive, terrifying trap was incredibly, completely, perfectly, brutally designed by men who entirely, completely understood physical destruction. The heavy, thick wooden scaffolding, entirely, severely, completely compromised by the deliberate, massive, treasonous sabotage, could absolutely not physically, mathematically support the massive, incredibly heavy combined weight of Helen and the heavily armored Alpha King. The thick wooden planks violently agonizingly groaned and violently splintered beneath his heavy iron boots, completely aggressively heavily, tearing further away from the massive solid stone wall. Down below in the dark freezing mud, General Fenwick slowly, deeply, violently smiled, completely, entirely, flawlessly believing that he had successfully, completely murdered the brilliant Omega Queen and the massive Broken King, completely, perfectly, successfully restoring the massive, toxic, arrogant alpha hierarchy of the bleeding Iron Keep. Helen hung completely, entirely, dangerously over the freezing, rushing abyss, her small, delicate body violently, completely swinging in the bitter, howling wind. She looked directly, deeply up into Kalen's massive, terrified eyes, completely, entirely realizing that his legendary, absolute, massive, raw physical strength was completely, absolutely useless against the massive, unyielding, heavy laws of physical gravity. The heavily broken wooden structure was actively, mathematically failing, completely preparing to violently, aggressively send them both crashing entirely directly into the massive, deadly, freezing rocks below. If he fiercely, loudly, aggressively tried to physically pull her heavily directly up, the massive, sudden, heavy kinetic shift would entirely, instantly, completely shatter the absolute last remaining heavy rope. A massive, terrifying, incredibly agonizing cliffhanger completely, aggressively, entirely gripped the freezing, violent gorge as Helen flawlessly, mathematically realized that absolute, pure physical survival completely, entirely depended entirely on her magnificent, brilliant mind, flawlessly, perfectly calculating the absolute exact heavy mathematical tension point to completely, miraculously, safely swing them directly toward the massive solid lower arch before the entire massive high structure completely, violently, catastrophically ripped entirely apart. The massive heavy wooden scaffolding groaned with a terrifying, deafening shriek as another thick support beam violently, completely shattered under the crushing weight of the heavily armored Alpha King. Helen dangled helplessly over the massive freezing gorge, the bitter wind whipping her dark hair aggressively across her pale, terrified face. Her delicate wrist was perfectly encased in Kalen's massive, heavily scarred hand, his incredible raw physical strength, the absolutely only tether keeping her from a catastrophic plunge into the deadly rushing river, waiting hungrily far below. But her calculating mind mathematically instantly realized that his legendary massive physical power was entirely working directly against their absolute survival. Every single time, he fiercely flexed his massive shoulder to physically, forcefully pull her up, the sudden kinetic shift aggressively tore another heavy rusted iron bolt directly out of the crumbling ancient stone foundation. The entire heavily sabotaged structure was mathematically designed to violently fail upon massive upward physical exertion. "Do not physically pull me, Kalen," she commanded, her smooth voice completely cutting flawlessly through the massive howling wind. Her brilliant, magnificent intellect completely forcefully shut out the terrifying absolute sheer drop beneath her striking amber eyes, rapidly scanning the heavily broken wooden structure directly above. She perfectly, mathematically, instantly simulated the massive physical tension currently screaming through the last remaining heavy support ropes. The entire massive broken platform was absolutely not just violently falling. It was mathematically, flawlessly swinging in a massive, deadly pendulum arc, completely driven by the violent, freezing mountain wind. The massive, toxic, arrogant generals had entirely expected the massive Alpha King to use heavy brute force to climb directly upward, perfectly guaranteeing their violent look directly at the massive lower load-bearing arch perfectly gracefully protruding from the solid eastern cliff face. Helen shouted, her brilliant, magnificent intellect entirely taking absolute supreme sovereign control of the terrifying, chaotic physical situation. She mathematically calculated the exact massive heavy trajectory of the violently swinging wooden platform, perfectly mapping the absolute precise geometric angle of the swinging drop. We absolutely cannot mathematically, physically climb up the heavy broken structure. The heavy tension ropes will instantly completely snap. We must completely use the massive violent kinetic momentum of the dropping structure to directly, forcefully swing our physical bodies directly toward that massive heavy stone arch. Kalen entirely stopped his desperate upward physical struggle, perfectly flawlessly trusting her absolute supreme mathematical command over his own massive blind animalistic survival instincts. His fierce dark eyes intensely tracked the massive heavy stone arch. It was incredibly dangerously far, a terrifying horizontal distance that seemed absolutely completely physically impossible for a heavy armored man carrying a fragile Omega. But he entirely completely trusted the magnificent brilliant Omega, vastly more than he trusted his own massive beating heart or his legendary military training. "I completely entirely trust your magnificent, beautiful mind, Helen," he fiercely roared, his deep raspy voice violently echoing against the steep, jagged, wet cliffs. "Tell me exactly what I must physically do, and I will flawlessly obey your absolute command." Her striking amber eyes rapidly, intensely tracked the violent swing of the heavily broken wooden platform, flawlessly mathematically measuring the exact terrifying physical velocity of their physical descent. The heavy splintering wood violently swung entirely outward, completely aggressively away from the massive solid cliff face, completely pushing them violently directly out over the massive deep dark gorge. Her highly logical, brilliant mind counted the absolute precise mathematical microseconds waiting for the exact perfect apex of the massive geometric arc. Now Helen fiercely commanded, flawlessly, perfectly predicting the absolute exact moment of maximum physical tension. You must forcefully push your heavy iron boots directly against the main vertical beam and violently launch us directly backward the exact microscopic second the structure violently swings back toward the solid cliff. Kalen did exactly as she flawlessly mathematically commanded, completely surrendering his massive raw physical body entirely to her supreme intellectual guidance. He waited for the absolute precise terrifying microsecond, entirely feeling the massive violent shift in the heavy kinetic momentum. With an absolutely massive deafening battle roar, he completely fiercely drove his heavy iron boots directly into the shattering wooden beam, entirely using his legendary massive raw physical strength, flawlessly guided by her supreme mathematical intellect. The heavy wooden scaffolding violently, catastrophically shattered, completely falling away into the deep dark abyss, a mere microscopic second after they violently, forcefully launched into the freezing empty air. They flew violently, completely through the bitter howling wind, their physical bodies, perfectly, mathematically following the exact massive geometric kinetic trajectory her brilliant mind had perfectly calculated. Kalen fiercely, tightly wrapped his massive muscular arms completely around her small, delicate frame, entirely physically shielding her from the brutal physical impact. They violently crashed directly onto the massive solid flat stone of the lower foundational arch, completely miraculously safe. The absolute brilliant supreme intellect of the fragile Omega had completely flawlessly conquered the massive toxic lethal brute force of the arrogant Alpha world. The massive violent adrenaline of their terrifying physical escape heavily violently crashed through Helen as she lay completely gasping on the cold solid stone of the lower eastern arch. The bitter freezing wind continued to violently aggressively whip through the massive dark gorge, but the absolute terrifying physical danger was completely entirely over. She had mathematically, flawlessly, perfectly saved them both from absolute brutal violent death entirely, using her magnificent brilliant mind. King Kalen lay heavily directly beside her, his massive heavily muscular chest violently heaving, as he desperately fiercely dragged massive heavy lungfuls of the freezing mountain air directly into his burning exhausted lungs. He completely, slowly, heavily rolled over onto his heavy armored side, his fierce dark eyes completely, intensely, perfectly locking onto her striking amber gaze. The massive, terrifying physical brush with absolute violent death had completely, entirely stripped away the absolute last remaining heavy, thick layers of his arrogant, toxic alpha pride, entirely, completely exposing his raw, vulnerable, aching soul directly to her magnificent, brilliant light. He completely, absolutely understood in that profound, quiet moment that his massive, raw physical strength was completely, utterly, entirely useless without her absolutely flawless guiding intellect. He absolutely mathematically realized that the massive, arrogant warrior hierarchy was a complete, deadly lie, entirely, completely shattered by the absolute, pure, magnificent truth of her brilliant mind. He slowly, heavily reached out his massive, thick, heavily scarred hand, incredibly gently, entirely, softly touching her pale, freezing cheek. The intense, massive, raw physical contact violently, aggressively, completely ignited the deeply buried, dying embers of their violently severed mating bond. Helen completely, entirely gasped as a massive, overwhelming, beautiful rush of pure, brilliant golden energy violently, aggressively, completely exploded directly within her fragile chest, entirely, flawlessly bridging the massive, dark, silent void between their profoundly, completely different souls. The heavily, violently severed sacred thread did not simply slowly, quietly mend, it completely, violently, powerfully, aggressively snapped directly back into perfect, absolute flaw. The massive sheer physical force of the profound spiritual reconnection sent a violent, massive, beautiful shockwave directly through the freezing damp air, completely, entirely pushing back the bitter, biting cold. She completely, intensely felt his absolute, profound, agonizing, heavy regret, his incredibly massive, deep, eternal, protective devotion, and his absolute, pure, staggering awe of her magnificent supreme intellect, violently, completely crashing directly into her brilliant mind, like a massive, beautiful tidal wave of pure, bright golden light. She could perfectly, mathematically, flawlessly see the absolute deep structural integrity of his massive, heavy soul, completely, entirely realizing that his fierce, arrogant exterior had completely, permanently crumbled into absolute, pure, beautiful submission. Her brilliant mind flawlessly registered the massive, absolute truth that his fierce, dark heart now entirely, perfectly belonged completely, absolutely to her. Kaelin fiercely, powerfully, aggressively pulled her fragile, freezing body directly into his massive, heavily muscular chest, completely, entirely enveloping her in a massive, thick, warm cocoon of absolute, pure physical protection. I completely, absolutely, blindly, foolishly rejected the absolute most magnificent, brilliant, beautiful soul in the entire massive known world, he whispered, his incredibly deep, raspy voice violently shaking with absolute, pure, devastating, agonizing, raw emotion. I was entirely, completely, mathematically, physically blind to the massive, profound, beautiful truth standing directly, perfectly in front of my heavy, arrogant eyes. You're completely, entirely, absolutely, the magnificent supreme queen of my massive, heavy physical heart, and the absolute, flawless, brilliant architect of my entire miserable, bloody existence. I completely, eternally submit my absolute, massive, raw physical power entirely to your perfect, magnificent, mathematical grace. Helen slowly, gracefully wrapped her small, delicate, calloused arms completely, entirely around his massive, thick, heavily armored neck, entirely, perfectly, mathematically, completely realizing that their profoundly, beautifully different strengths perfectly, flawlessly, beautifully completed each other. Her absolute, supreme, brilliant mathematical intellect entirely, perfectly guided his legendary, massive, raw physical power, entirely, completely forging an absolute, unbreakable, magnificent, eternal union of deep, beautiful mind and heavy physical muscle. She felt the heavy, rhythmic beating of his massive physical heart, perfectly mathematically aligning with the incredibly rapid, brilliant calculations constantly running entirely perfectly through her magnificent, awakened mind. The massive, heavy, bright golden light of their completely, perfectly restored mating bond violently, aggressively, powerfully radiated entirely outward, completely, physically warming the freezing, damp, ancient stone beneath their heavily exhausted physical bodies. It was an absolute, profound, beautiful, spiritual, ritual transformation, entirely, perfectly, mathematically, completely sealing their eternal, magnificent, romantic fate. She absolutely, completely, entirely forgave his massive, heavy, blind, arrogant, violent past, entirely, completely, perfectly recognizing the absolute, massive, profound, internal, structural, emotional transformation he had violently, agonizingly, completely endured. He was entirely, completely, absolutely no longer the massive, toxic, arrogant, aggressive king who violently, foolishly, loudly laughed at her highly complex mathematical blueprints. He was her absolute, perfect, fierce, eternally loyal physical protector, completely, entirely, perfectly submitting his massive, heavy physical existence entirely to her absolute, brilliant, mathematical sovereign command. They slowly, completely, powerfully rose from the cold, hard, flat stone, perfectly, entirely, flawlessly, beautifully united. Helen looked deeply, intensely up at the massive, dark, dangerous ruins of the Iron Keep towering violently far above them, her striking amber eyes violently, aggressively, beautifully burning with absolute, pure, undeniable sovereign fire. She was completely, entirely, perfectly, mathematically, completely ready to completely physically, absolutely mathematically, permanently destroy the massive, arrogant, treasonous military generals who had violently, foolishly dared to physically challenge her magnificent, brilliant architectural throne. They would completely, flawlessly ascend the massive broken cliffs together, perfectly ready to entirely, completely, violently cleanse the massive bleeding kingdom of its highly toxic, heavy, arrogant darkness. The freezing dark mud of the central courtyard was completely saturated with the toxic, arrogant whispers of the elite royal vanguard. General Fenwick stood proudly near the massive burning fire pit, loudly boasting to his armored commanders about the tragic mathematical accident that had violently claimed the fragile life of their new architect queen and the broken. He had completely, entirely planned to loudly, aggressively declare a massive royal state of emergency, entirely preparing to seize absolute military control over the bleeding kingdom. He heavily drank from a thick wooden tankard, his scarred face twisting into a highly cruel, victorious sneer, blindly believing his massive, lethal architectural trap had perfectly eliminated the magnificent, brilliant Omega, who dared to physically command his elite men. But his toxic, arrogant laughter violently, abruptly died in his raw throat as a terrifying, heavy silence completely swept through the massive, muddy courtyard. The heavy armored soldiers slowly, anxiously backed away from the grand stone archway, their scarred faces entirely paling in absolute, pure, staggering, terrified disbelief. King Kaelin and Helen slowly, powerfully walked directly through the massive, shattered iron gates, completely, miraculously alive and entirely, flawlessly united. Kaelin's massive armor was violently scraped and heavily dented from the massive, terrifying physical impact, but his fierce, dark eyes violently, completely burned with absolute, pure, murderous fury. He entirely walked slightly behind Helen, perfectly, flawlessly, visually demonstrating to the terrified army that he was completely nothing but the massive physical shield entirely dedicated to protecting her magnificent, brilliant mind. Helen marched entirely confidently forward, her striking amber eyes flawlessly locking onto the massive, arrogant general. She absolutely did not look like a fragile, terrified victim violently thrown into a freezing dark gorge. She looked like an absolute magnificent supreme sovereign goddess of pure intellectual truth, completely ready to mathematically violently destroy the heavy toxic darkness of the massive royal court. Fenwick heavily dropped his thick wooden tankard, the dark, bitter ale violently spilling into the freezing dirty mud. He frantically, aggressively grasped the heavy iron hilt of his broadsword, completely entirely preparing to loudly, falsely declare them massive dark imposters or enemy spies. But Helen completely, smoothly, elegantly unrolled her massive, heavy architectural parchment entirely, flawlessly, tossing it directly onto the flat stone table perfectly situated in the exact center of the massive military camp. She completely, entirely ignored his massive, heavy, aggressive posturing, flawlessly, perfectly, mathematically dismantling his entire massive, toxic, treasonous lie with absolute, pure, undeniable logic. "You're completely mathematically, physically incompetent, Fenwick," she stated, her incredibly smooth voice carrying an absolute, undeniable, terrifying sovereign authority that completely echoed against the high shattered walls. "You entirely falsely claimed my highly complex curved interlocking stones were mathematically unstable, entirely aggressively, using your massive false military ignorance to deliberately, completely, physically mask your highly toxic massive treason." She slowly, gracefully pointed her small, delicate, callous finger directly at the massive, heavy structural equations, perfectly, flawlessly drawn on the thick parchment. She completely mathematically detailed exactly how the heavy, thick iron linchpins were highly deliberately, violently removed from the massive central load-bearing brackets, entirely perfectly proving that the massive physical failure was absolutely not a tragic architectural accident, but a highly calculated, brutal military assassination attempt. She mathematically, flawlessly described the exact violent physical angle of the slashed heavy support ropes, completely, entirely proving that absolute raw physical force was violently used to deliberately, severely compromise the high wooden scaffolding exactly 3 hours before the massive critical royal inspection. The heavily armored soldiers, standing entirely, completely around the massive burning fire pit, collectively, violently gasped in absolute, pure, terrifying realization, entirely, completely, mathematically recognizing the absolute, heavy, dark truth of her brilliant, flawless words. General Fenwick violently, aggressively flushed a deep, highly dangerous purple, his massive, heavy, toxic alpha pride, completely, entirely, violently shattering under the massive, undeniable, crushing weight of her absolute, supreme intellectual proof. He fiercely, loudly roared, drawing his heavy iron broadsword, completely, entirely preparing to violently, brutally, physically attack the brilliant, fragile Omega, who had perfectly, flawlessly, mathematically, completely destroyed his massive, arrogant military career. But King Kalen violently, aggressively lunged forward with absolute, pure, breathtaking, massive physical speed, entirely, completely intercepting the heavy, toxic commander before his heavy, rusted blade could even violently swing. Kalen, massive, heavy iron boot, violently, brutally struck Fenwick directly in the heavy armored chest, completely, entirely sending the massive, arrogant general violently crashing backward into the freezing, dirty mud. Kalen, massive, heavy silver broadsword, violently, completely, instantly pressed directly against Fenwick, thick, violently pulsing throat, his fierce dark eyes completely burning with massive, pure, absolute protective devotion for his magnificent, brilliant queen. "You absolutely, violently dared to physically threaten the absolute, magnificent, supreme savior of this massive, bleeding kingdom," Kalen heavily, fiercely roared, his incredibly deep, raspy voice violently shaking the freezing, damp air. "You will completely, entirely face the absolute, massive, brutal, physical consequences of your highly toxic mathematical treason." But Helen slowly, gracefully, completely, entirely raised her small, delicate hand, flawlessly, perfectly stopping the massive, fierce Alpha King from violently executing the heavy, toxic general in the dirty, gray mud. "I absolutely, completely refuse to build my magnificent new massive kingdom upon a dark, toxic foundation of massive, blind, violent blood," she stated coldly, her striking amber eyes entirely, flawlessly, completely dominating the massive, broken military commander. "You will absolutely not violently die, Fenwick. You will completely, entirely spend the absolute rest of your miserable, bloody, physical existence violently, heavily hauling the massive, dirty, raw stone, exactly mathematically directed by the brilliant, magnificent Omega scholars you so deeply despised. Your massive, heavy, raw physical strength will absolutely, completely, entirely serve my magnificent, brilliant, intellectual vision, completely, flawlessly, perfectly proving to the entire known world that absolute, raw physical might is absolutely, entirely subordinate to pure mathematical truth." The heavy, toxic clouds that had violently, completely choked the ruined Iron Keep for agonizing weeks finally miraculously broke apart, allowing magnificent, brilliant rays of warm, golden sunlight to perfectly illuminate the massive, muddy courtyard. Helen stood perfectly with massive, flat stone table, completely surrounded by the entire heavily armored royal vanguard and the terrified surviving nobles of the High Court. The massive, arrogant military commanders, who had once cruelly laughed at her fragile Omega status, now knelt completely deeply in their heavy, thick heads violently bowed in absolute pure staggering reverence. King Kalen stood directly heavily below her, his massive, heavily armored body completely covered in dirty gray ash, but his fierce dark eyes violently completely burned with absolute pure magnificent devotion. He slowly, heavily reached up and completely entirely unbuckled the heavy thick iron clasp of his magnificent dark royal cape. He completely flawlessly let the massive heavy symbol of his absolute toxic alpha military dominance violently aggressively fall directly into the freezing dirty mud entirely perfectly, signaling the absolute profound end of the massive cruel warrior. He did not fiercely loudly demand absolute blind submission from his massive bleeding people. He slowly heavily reached into the deep thick leather pouch resting against his massive broad chest, completely entirely pulling out a magnificent breathtaking crown, forged not from heavy rusted iron or massive brutal broadswords but from highly complex interlocking bands of pure solid gold and brilliant clear crystal. He had completely entirely secretly commanded the master smiths to perfectly flawlessly build this magnificent supreme symbol of absolute intellectual light, completely entirely recognizing that her brilliant mathematical mind was the absolute only true magnificent salvation for his heavily broken world. Kalen slowly, heavily climbed the massive jagged stone steps, his heavy iron boots perfectly deliberately making absolutely no loud aggressive sounds. He completely violently, entirely lowered his massive heavy muscular frame perfectly directly onto his heavily scarred knees before her entirely physically visually proving to the massive entire known world that the absolute fiercest most terrifying Alpha King completely perfectly eternally served the magnificent brilliant Omega Queen. I completely absolutely blindly shattered this massive kingdom with my heavy toxic arrogant pride, Kalen stated, his incredibly deep raspy voice violently echoing with absolute pure devastating undeniable sincerity across the silent massive courtyard. I fiercely loudly worshipped massive raw physical force entirely completely violently blinding my dark soul to the absolute magnificent breathtaking truth of your brilliant mind. You entirely miraculously saved my massive broken existence and completely mathematically flawlessly proved that absolute supreme power is entirely perfectly born from deep, profound quiet creation, not massive brutal destruction. He slowly heavily raised the magnificent highly complex crystal crown, his massive thick heavily scarred hands, trembling violently with absolute pure profound staggering emotion. I entirely completely beg you to perfectly flawlessly accept the massive royal crown, Helen. I absolutely entirely completely surrender the massive heavy absolute command of my entire miserable bloody kingdom directly into your small brilliant delicate hands. You're absolutely entirely completely the supreme magnificent architect queen, and I'm completely nothing but the massive physical shield eternally heavily dedicated to violently aggressively protecting your flawless mathematical light. Helen looked deeply intensely down at the massive fierce Alpha King, completely perfectly registering the absolute profound heavy agonizing internal structural transformation he had violently beautifully endured. She vividly remembered the brutal crushing agonizing weight of her heavily abused past, completely remembering how she used to frantically hide her brilliant magnificent architectural blueprints in the freezing dark cellars. She had completely entirely flawlessly survived the absolute toxic brutal cruelty of the massive heavy arrogant world and entirely beautifully perfectly emerged as absolute magnificent undeniable supreme master. She slowly gracefully elegantly reached out her small delicate calloused hands entirely perfectly taking the magnificent highly complex crystal crown directly from his massive heavy scarred grasp. She did not quietly submissively completely lower her beautiful dark head to be traditionally proudly crowned by a massive alpha. She completely entirely flawlessly perfectly placed the magnificent bright crystal crown directly onto her own beautifully tired head, entirely mathematically, completely claiming her absolute supreme sovereign authority upon her own magnificent empowering terms. I completely absolutely accept the massive heavy burden of this bleeding broken kingdom, Helen loudly powerfully declared, her incredibly smooth voice ringing with absolute pure undeniable terrifying intellectual authority. But I entirely completely violently refuse to flawlessly quietly perfectly rule this massive heavy world using the toxic arrogant ancient laws of massive raw physical dominance. I completely perfectly mathematically decree that from this absolute precise magnificent microsecond forward the massive heavy rigid warrior caste system is entirely completely permanently abolished. The massive heavily armored nobles collectively violently gasped in absolute pure staggering shock, but the fierce dark eyes of King Kalen violently aggressively powerfully burned with absolute pure magnificent fierce pride completely perfectly physically supporting her massive revolutionary architectural command We will entirely, completely, beautifully rebuild this massive shattered fortress. Helen fiercely commanded, her striking amber eyes completely flawlessly dominating the massive silent courtyard. But we will absolutely, entirely, not perfectly mathematically rebuild the dark, freezing cells that brutally, violently crush the fragile, brilliant spirits of my quiet Omega people. We will perfectly, flawlessly build massive, towering academies of brilliant, supreme intellectual light and massive, beautiful, grand libraries of complex mathematical truth. Absolute, profound, magnificent intelligence will completely, entirely outrank massive, raw physical muscle, and absolutely no brilliant, quiet soul will ever violently, heavily scrub a freezing, dirty stone floor in absolute, terrified, invisible silence again. A massive, terrifying, incredibly beautiful, profound cliffhanger completely, aggressively, violently gripped the bright, magnificent morning air, as Helen completely, perfectly, entirely, flawlessly, mathematically realized that entirely, beautifully changing the ancient, toxic, rigid laws was merely the absolute, completely first massive physical step, and that the absolute, true, massive, heavy, agonizing structural work of entirely, completely, perfectly, mathematically rebuilding a massive, magnificent, enlightened, beautiful empire, completely from the dark, freezing dust, was about to violently, aggressively, beautifully begin. The massive physical transformation of the Bleeding Kingdom began exactly at the breaking of the first golden dawn. Helen completely, entirely, absolutely refused to wait a single day to violently, aggressively tear down the massive, toxic, archaic laws that had brutally crushed her quiet Omega people for centuries. She sat perfectly, flawlessly, straight at the massive, heavy stone table in the grand courtyard, her striking amber eyes entirely, intensely focused on a massive, heavy stack of ancient royal decrees. King Kalen stood perfectly, quietly, directly behind her, his massive, heavily muscular arms crossed over his thick, broad chest, his fierce, dark eyes completely, entirely, constantly scanning the massive courtyard for any absolute physical threat to her magnificent, brilliant mind. He completely, flawlessly, visually, perfectly, physically supported every single massive, revolutionary, mathematical decree she rapidly, flawlessly dictated to the highly terrified, trembling royal scribes. I completely, absolutely decree that the massive, heavy, rigid warrior caste system is entirely, permanently, violently dismantled. Helen stated, her incredibly smooth voice ringing with absolute, pure, undeniable sovereign authority. The absolute, massive physical ability to swing a heavy, rusted broadsword or violently, aggressively conquer a neighboring valley will absolutely no longer completely dictate a person's absolute true worth in this massive, new, enlightened kingdom. She completely, mathematically dictated that the massive, heavy royal budget entirely previously wasted on massive, aggressive military campaigns and highly toxic, arrogant weapon forging would be completely, entirely, immediately redirected. The massive, heavy royal gold will entirely, completely, flawlessly fund the rapid, massive construction of towering, magnificent, grand academies and deep, vast, beautiful libraries of complex mathematical truth. She entirely, perfectly, mathematically decreed that absolute, profound intellectual brilliance and fierce, resilient, tactical logic would forever completely outrank massive, heavy physical. The highly decorated, massive, arrogant alpha generals who had entirely, violently survived the massive, brutal architectural purge stood completely silently in the freezing mud, their massive, heavy heads entirely bowed. They completely, flawlessly, mathematically realized that they had absolutely no massive, raw physical power left to violently, fiercely challenge her magnificent, supreme intellectual rule. If they dared to violently, fiercely speak a single massive, arrogant word against her magnificent mathematical laws, the massive, terrifying Alpha King, standing directly behind her, would completely, violently, aggressively ensure their massive, brutal physical destruction. But Helen entirely, completely, mathematically, absolutely did not brutally enslave the massive, heavy physical warriors. She perfectly, flawlessly, mathematically, entirely redirected their massive, heavy physical strength toward magnificent, absolute, beautiful creation. You will completely, absolutely no longer violently, aggressively destroy massive rival fortresses, she told the massive silent army. You will perfectly, flawlessly, mathematically use your massive, raw physical strength to entirely, completely build massive, safe, sturdy roads, deep, secure wells, and magnificent, beautiful, towering bridges that will perfectly, flawlessly connect our massive, divided people. The entire massive shattered Iron Keep violently, aggressively, rapidly transformed into a breathtaking, beautiful, towering masterpiece of supreme civil engineering and absolute profound enlightenment. The highly terrified quiet Omega scholars, who had spent massive, agonizing decades frantically hiding their brilliant, magnificent minds in the dark, damp, freezing cellars, were entirely, completely, flawlessly elevated to the absolute highest royal council positions. Helen completely, mathematically ensured that the massive, beautiful, heavy, grand drafting halls were completely, perfectly filled with young, fragile, brilliant Omegas entirely, completely, loudly, proudly, safely discussing highly complex mathematical equations, completely, perfectly protected by the massive, heavy silver armor of the fiercely loyal Royal Vanguard. She watched completely entirely filled with a massive, overwhelming, beautiful, profound emotional pride as the exact people who had been violently treated like worthless dust were now flawlessly, systematically recognized as the absolute highest sovereign saviors of the massive grand realm. Kaelin completely entirely flawlessly embraced the massive, profound, beautiful cultural transformation, completely flawlessly proving his absolute massive eternal devotion to her supreme intellect. He completely mathematically retrained his entire massive heavy physical army, completely entirely violently aggressively teaching the young arrogant alpha recruits to profoundly deeply respect the quiet tactical scholars and to blindly flawlessly follow the brilliant strategic commands of the Omega architects. The absolute massive terrifying Alpha King completely perfectly entirely spent his long warm evenings perfectly quietly sitting beside his magnificent brilliant queen entirely deeply mesmerized by the flawless rapid movements of her small delicate calloused hands as she beautifully perfectly designed massive new soaring defensive structures. Their deeply, profoundly, beautifully restored mating bond completely perfectly fiercely brightly flourished in the warm beautiful golden light, entirely completely free from the massive toxic dark agonizing shadows of their miserable bloody past. He constantly deeply respectfully humbly sought her magnificent flawless mathematical counsel, his massive fierce eternal physical devotion entirely completely perfectly evident in every single deeply affectionate physical glance and every fiercely protective gentle heavy touch. They were the absolute magnificent perfect flawless embodiment of true undeniable equal sovereign power entirely perfectly bridging massive raw physical might with absolute pure unparalleled mathematical intellect. The massive bleeding ruined kingdom completely entirely miraculously beautifully healed entirely completely violently transforming from a massive toxic arrogant dark military dictatorship directly into a breathtaking thriving impenetrable massive sanctuary of deep profound intellectual knowledge and absolute undeniable peaceful prosperity. But a massive, terrifying, incredibly beautiful, profound cliffhanger, completely aggressively violently gripped the warm, gentle spring breeze, exactly as Helen slowly, gracefully, mathematically placed her small, delicate, calloused hands entirely perfectly directly over her lower stomach. She completely, flawlessly, perfectly, mathematically realized that her absolute, magnificent, revolutionary structural legacy was entirely, completely, absolutely no longer just a massive, brilliant political idea, but a completely undeniable, rapidly growing, beautiful physical reality, entirely completely. Perfectly preparing to introduce a completely new, magnificent, powerful heir to the beautifully transformed grand massive empire. The grand magnificent Eastern Empire had completely flawlessly blossomed into an absolute breathtaking impenetrable fortress of pure profound intellectual light and undeniable peaceful prosperity. Years had passed since the massive heavy toxic shadow of the arrogant military vanguard had been completely permanently banished from the high royal court. The massive ruined iron keep was entirely absolutely no longer a dark freezing monument to massive brutal physical destruction. It had been completely flawlessly beautifully rebuilt by the magnificent brilliant architect queen into a massive towering soaring masterpiece of complex mathematical engineering. Massive beautiful high vaulted arches of smooth polished white stone perfectly gracefully stretched across the deep rushing gorge entirely replacing the jagged broken rocks with massive breathtaking bridges of pure absolute structural integrity. Warm golden brilliant sunlight completely perfectly flooded the massive grand courtyards where the heavily armed royal guards now peacefully respectfully stood watch over thousands of rigorously studying brilliant scholars. Helen stood gracefully elegantly upon the high soaring magnificent balcony, her beautifully tailored deep sapphire gown blowing softly completely perfectly in the warm gentle mountain breeze. Her striking amber eyes completely intensely looked deeply down at the massive, thriving, beautiful capital city, her brilliant, magnificent mind flawlessly mathematically registering the absolute perfect structural harmony of her massive entire physical creation. She had completely entirely perfectly saved a massive, bleeding, broken world, not by violently aggressively swinging a heavy rusted broadsword, but by completely flawlessly trusting the absolute pure undeniable sovereign power of her magnificent, brilliant mind. She was absolutely no longer the fragile, terrified, invisible servant, forced to rigorously scrub freezing, dirty floors in complete agonizing silence. She was the absolute magnificent, supreme sovereign architect who had completely, permanently, violently rewritten the massive, toxic, heavy laws of an entire ancient civilization. King Kaelin stepped completely quietly, softly onto the magnificent high balcony, his massive, heavily muscular frame moving with an absolute, profound, gentle grace. He wore a simple, highly elegant dark velvet tunic, completely entirely devoid of any massive heavy toxic military armor. His fierce dark eyes were completely perfectly entirely fixed upon his magnificent brilliant queen, his massive heavy soul completely eternally radiating an absolute pure, undeniable, staggering devotion. He completely softly, gently wrapped his massive, thick, heavily scarred arms entirely perfectly around her delicate waist, violently aggressively pulling her fragile, warm body completely directly against his broad, massive chest. Their deeply, profoundly beautiful mating bond perfectly flawlessly hummed with an absolute, massive, unbreakable, bright golden energy, entirely perfectly bridging the absolute magnificent quiet strength of her mind with the absolute eternal raw physical protection of his massive heart. Look deeply at the absolute magnificent profound legacy you have completely flawlessly mathematically built, Kaylin whispered incredibly deeply, his raspy smooth voice completely warmly vibrating against her delicate collarbone. The massive, arrogant, heavy world I foolishly aggressively created was entirely completely destined to violently aggressively crumble into dark free. But your magnificent, brilliant structural truth has completely, absolutely, entirely forged a massive, beautiful, enlightened empire that will perfectly, flawlessly stand unbroken for 10,000 massive, glorious years. Helen completely, softly, gently leaned her dark, beautiful head entirely perfectly back against his massive, strong shoulder, completely filled with a massive, overwhelming, profound, agonizingly beautiful joy. Her striking amber eyes perfectly, flawlessly tracked the graceful, quick movements of their young, brilliant daughter, currently, loudly, proudly instructing a massive, heavy class of young alpha warriors in the highly complex science of massive foundational engineering. We completely mathematically, flawlessly built this massive, magnificent world entirely perfectly together. Kaylin, she stated, her incredibly smooth voice carrying an absolute, pure, undeniable, peaceful, sovereign warmth. The massive, heavy, raw stone absolutely entirely requires both the magnificent, brilliant mathematical vision to properly, perfectly guide it, and the massive, dedicated, heavy physical strength to flawlessly, perfectly haul it into the bright light. You completely, perfectly, physically protected my fragile, brilliant mind so I could completely, flawlessly, structurally protect your massive, bleeding kingdom. Kaylin slowly, heavily turned her fragile, delicate frame completely directly toward him, his intense, fierce, dark eyes entirely perfectly, completely shining with absolute, pure, massive, romantic reverence. He gently, softly tilted her beautiful, proud chin, completely, perfectly capturing her soft, warm lips in an incredibly deep, profoundly beautiful, romantic kiss, entirely, perfectly sealing their massive, undeniable, eternal, sovereign equality. The beautiful, magnificent, bright future of the Grand Eastern Empire was completely, entirely, flawlessly, mathematically secure, entirely, perfectly, deeply protected by the massive, brilliant, intellectual light of a completely unbreakable architect queen. Her magnificent, towering, massive stone walls would absolutely, entirely, completely, never violently fall again. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you. Disclaimer: this video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, settings, and events depicted are entirely imaginary and are not intended to represent real-life people or situations. Please view for entertainment purposes only.